The term rigor is widely used by educators to describe instruction, schoolwork, learning experiences, and educational expectations that are academically, intellectually, and personally challenging. Rigorous learning experiences, for example, help students understand knowledge and concepts that are complex, ambiguous, or contentious, and they help students acquire skills that can be applied in a variety of educational, career, and civic contexts throughout their lives. To paraphrase Ronald Williamson and Barbara Blackburn on their Recognizing Rigor in Classrooms 4 Tools for School Leaders, rigor is about expectations. Rigor is creating an environment in which each student is expected to learn at high levels. Also, with high expectations, it is important to have instructional supports to simultaneously provide ongoing scaffolding to support students' learning as they reach higher levels. Another component of addressing rigor is exposure. Students need opportunities to demonstrate learning at high levels. For us to look at cognitive demands of these items, we need to be mindful of the rigor distribution. It is important to look at instructional practices that expect students to learn at very high levels, and that also give students the support to achieve. And in assessment, not all items should fall on a very demanding spectrum of rigor. So what is rigor? Here are some general reasons and considerations of rigor in item development. For the development of assessment items and tasks, universal design aims to create items and tasks that accurately measure the targeted knowledge, skills, and abilities for all students. Valid assessments of student knowledge, skills, and abilities requires a two-way communication between an assessment item and a student that involves 3 critical steps. The first, focus on presenting information to a student in order to activate or stimulate the knowledge, skill, or ability that is the target of the assessment. Second, student is provided an opportunity to interact with the content that is presented by an item as he or she applies the targeted knowledge, skill, or ability. Third, the student provides evidence about their knowledge, skill, or ability through the response to an assessment item or task. It is through this 3-step process that an assessment item or task attempts to access the targeted knowledge, skills, or abilities that operate within a student. For the cognitive rigor to be attended to, item writers must consider the depth and breadth of knowledge communicated by these targeted expectations. An aligned assessment must include items and tasks requiring the highest level of cognitive complexity prescribed by the assessment claims and targets. The Smarter Balanced Assessment has adopted the Cognitive Rigor Matrix for the assessment program. This matrix draws from 2 widely accepted measures to describe cognitive rigor: Bloom's Revised Taxonomy of Educational Objectives and Webb's Depth of Knowledge Levels. The Cognitive Rigor Matrix has been developed to integrate these 2 models as a strategy for analyzing instruction, for influencing teacher lesson planning, and for designing assessment items and tasks. This matrix was developed by Karen Hess. The Common Core state standards require high-level cognitive demand, such as requiring students to demonstrate deeper conceptual understanding through the application of content knowledge and skills to new situations and sustained tasks. We will preface the cognitive rigor matrix used by the Smarter Balanced Assessment by providing a brief history of the revised Bloom's taxonomy and the depth of knowledge. Although related, their ties to complexity of thought, these methods differ in scope and application. Bloom's taxonomy characterizes the cognitive skills required of the brain to perform a task, describing the type of thinking processes necessary to answer a question. Depth of knowledge relates more closely to the depth of content understanding and scope of learning activity, which manifests in the skills required to complete the task from inception to conclusion. The cognitive rigor matrix allows educators to examine the depth of understanding required from different tasks that at first glance seem comparable. The cognitive rigor matrix allows educators to uniquely characterize and examine selected assignments and learning activities that appear in curriculum and instruction. The cognitive rigor encompasses the complexity of content, the cognitive engagement with that content, and the scope of the planned learning activities. The cognitive rigor matrix has significant potential to enhance instructional and assessment practices at the classroom level. Ensuring that the curriculum is aligned to rigorous state content standards is in itself insufficient for preparing students for the challenges of the 21st century. Current research on the factors influencing student outcomes and contributing to academic richness supports the concept that learning is optimized when students are involved in activities that require complex thinking and the application of knowledge. Students learn skills and acquire knowledge more readily than they understand concepts more deeply, recognize their relevance, and can transfer that learning to a newer or more complex situation. Different states, schools, teachers use different models to describe cognitive rigor. In short, what is the difference between Bloom's taxonomy and Norman Webb's depth of knowledge? For Bloom, it is what type of thinking, or the verbs that are needed to complete the task. In Webb's depth of knowledge, how deeply do you need to understand the content to successfully interact with it? Here is a look at Bloom's taxonomy from 1956 versus the revised Bloom's process dimensions of 2001. In 1956, Benjamin Bloom developed a taxonomy of the importance to learning. Bloom's committee identified 3 domains of educational activities: cognitive, affective, and the psychomotor. Within the cognitive domain, which is tied directly to the mental skills, Bloom identified the hierarchy of 6 levels that increased in complexity and abstraction from the simple recall of facts and knowledge to the highest order of thinking, such as evaluation. The revised taxonomy table employs 2 dimensions: cognitive processes and the knowledge. The cognitive processes resemble those found in the original taxonomy, but placement on the taxonomy continuum has changed slightly. For instance, the evaluation no longer resides at the highest level, and descriptions have been expanded and better differentiated for analyzing educational objectives. The revised descriptors consider both the processes, the verbs, and the knowledge used to articulate the educational objectives. This restructuring of the original taxonomy recognizes the importance of interaction between what content is taught, characterized by factual, conceptual, and procedural, and the metacognitive knowledge. Bloom's taxonomy provides a way to organize thinking skills into 6 levels, from the most basic to the more complex levels of thinking. These 6 levels provide us with a way to express qualitatively the different kinds of thinking. Let's look at remembering. Can the student recall or remember the information? Let's look at understanding. Can the student explain ideas or concepts? Apply. Can the student use the information in a new way? Analyze. Can the student distinguish between the different parts? Evaluating. Can the student justify a decision? Creating. Can the student create a new product or point of view? Here's Norman Webb's depth of knowledge levels. Depth of knowledge. How deeply do you have to know the content to be successful? Norman Webb's depth of knowledge forced states to rethink the meaning of test alignment to include both the content assessed in a test item and the intended cognitive demand, or the depth to which we expect students to demonstrate understanding of that content. Webb describes his depth of knowledge levels as normative rather than a taxonomy, meaning that the depth of knowledge levels describe 4 different and deeper ways a student might interact with the content. Unlike Bloom's taxonomy, the depth of knowledge levels do not necessarily correlate to the difficulty. These depth of knowledge levels help states and districts utilize the concept of the depth of knowledge to designate the depth and complexity of state standards in order to align the state's large-scale assessments or to revise existing standards to achieve higher cognitive levels for instruction. Consequently, instruction should call for a greater range of cognitive demand. The Common Core State Standards expect students to perform higher on cognitively demanding tasks, but how do you know that the tasks of the students meet these rigorous standards? Depth of knowledge is one way to measure these cognitive demands of the tasks. By using the 4 levels that build in complexity, cognitive rigor looks at the depth of knowledge as well as the type of thinking required for students to interact with and respond to content. Depth of knowledge 1. Students need to elicit and recall information or reproduce information. Level 2. Students should focus on skills, concepts, and basic reasoning. Level 3. Expect strategic thinking and complex reasoning. Level 4. Require extended thinking. Here's one way many districts look at depth of knowledge. The level of the depth of knowledge is determined by the task, defined by the complex thinking and reasoning skills. It is not by the grade level or the ability of the student. Therefore, the depth of knowledge of the task does not change with the grade or the ability of the student. Verbs alone do not determine the depth of knowledge's level of an assessment task. The depth of knowledge focus on how deeply the students need to know the content for a given response. This presentation that is commonly used with schools and school districts is not sanctioned or authorized by Norman Webb. Depth of knowledge is not just about a verb. So to reiterate, depth of knowledge is not about difficulty. It is about complexity. It is not about the verbs. Verbs are not always used appropriately. It is not about the student or level of difficulty for the student. It requires looking at the assessment item, not student work, in order to determine the level. Depth of knowledge is about what follows the verb. What comes after the verb is more important than the verb itself. It is about the complexity of mental processing that must occur to answer a question. In assessment, you should have a range of depth of knowledge levels. You need to have a variety of these levels in order to provide a foundation for students. Let's tease through an example of these claims and targets for items instead of working backwards with an item to showcase the rigor points. So here we have a English Language Arts literacy claim and supporting evidence about this claim. Let's focus on grade 4, where there are 7 targets on this claim. Target 1, key details. Given an inference or conclusion, use explicit details and implicit information from the text to support the inference or the conclusion provided. Here our target would be a depth of knowledge 1 or 2. Shown here is a literary passage. We will use this as reference for the tasks that are presented in this slide. On the left-hand side of the item-specific table, Claim 1 states, students can read closely and analytically to comprehend a range of increasingly complex literary and informational text. The target 5 states, analysis within or across text, interpret, specify, or compare how information is presented across text, first-person or third-person point of view, visual oral formats, topics, themes, patterns of events. In secondary targets, key details, use explicit details and implicit information from the text to support answers or basic inferences. For this table, we're looking at depth of knowledge targets of 3 and 4. The evidence required. When reading literary text, students should cite evidence, and they should make comparisons of how information is related to the theme or topic. The allowable item and types for this would be construct a response. On the right-hand image, we can see a smarter balanced sample task. This shows us how the item specification table was put into use, but how this item or task contributes to the sufficient evidence for this claim. When students read and interpret excerpts from 2 different literary texts, they will compare how patterns of events in the text are similar. Rigor is not mutually exclusive. It is how deeply must the student engage in the content, as well as what type of thinking is needed for the student to complete the task. NAEP refers to student performance on items by scoring multiple choice or constructed response questions as either right or wrong, whereas 60% or more of students have answered this item correctly. Medium items are where 40 to 59% of students have answered this item correctly. Hard items are where fewer than 40% of students have answered this item correctly. When we talk about rigor, we are interested in knowing the mental processes and the actions that students take in demonstrating their understanding. Now we will look at how we can raise the bar when we're looking specifically at content area rigor. For more specifics on the DOK levels, please see the handout. Now we're going to look at each of the descriptions under the depth of knowledge definitions. Under depth of knowledge 1, we have recall and reproduction. Here we have some specific description terms that can help you in making alignment judgments. For depth of knowledge 2, basic application of skills and concepts. Depth of knowledge 3, strategic thinking and reasoning. We have our definition, followed by our descriptions. And for depth of knowledge 4, extended thinking, again we have our definition, followed by more descriptive terms that can be used in making our alignment judgments. According to Norman Webb's depth of knowledge levels for the 4 content areas published in 2002, interpreting and assigning depth of knowledge levels to objectives both within standards and assessment items is an essential requirement of alignment analysis. 4 levels of depth of knowledge are used for this analysis. Because the highest, that is, the depth of knowledge 4, is rare or even absent in most standardized assessments, reviewers will usually be making distinctions between depth of knowledge 1, 2, and 3. Here we're looking at the depth of knowledge 1, recall, for reading. Reading at a level 1 requires students to receive or recite facts or use simple skills or abilities. Oral reading that does not include analysis of text as well as basic comprehension of a text is included. Items require only a shallow understanding of the text presented and often consist of verbatim recall from text or simple understanding of single word or phrase. Some examples that represent but do not constitute all of Level 1 performance are support ideas by reference to details in the text, use a dictionary to find the meaning of the words, identify figurative language in a reading passage. For writing, you would use punctuation marks correctly, identify standard English grammatical structures, and refer to resources for correction. For reading Depth of Knowledge 2, Skills and Concepts, a Level 2 includes the engagement of some mental processing beyond recalling or reproducing a response. It requires both comprehension and subsequent processing of text or proportions of text. Inner sentence analysis of inference is required. Some important concepts are covered, but not in a complex way. Standards and items at this level may include words such as summarize, interpret, infer, classify, organize, collect, display, compare, and determine whether fact or opinion. Literal main ideas are stressed. A Level 2 assessment may require students to apply some of the skills and concepts that are covered in Level 1. Some examples that represent but do not constitute all of Level 2 performance are use context cues to identify the meaning of unfamiliar words, predict a logical outcome based on information in a reading selection, identify and summarize the major events in a narrative. In writing, a Level 2 would be construct compound sentences, use simple organizational strategies to structure written work. In reading for a Depth of Knowledge 3, the strategic thinking, deep knowledge becomes more of a focus at Level 3. Students are encouraged to go beyond the text, however they are still required to show understanding of the ideas in text. Students may be encouraged to explain, generalize, or connect ideas. Standards and items at Level 3 involve reasoning and planning. Students must be able to support their thinking. Items may involve abstract theme identification, inference across an entire passage, or students' application of prior knowledge. Items may involve more superficial connections between texts. Some examples that represent but do not constitute all of Level 3 performance are determine the author's purpose and describe how it affects the interpretation of a reading selection. Summarize the information from multiple sources to address a specific topic. Analyze and describe the characteristics of various types of literature. For writing, at a Level 3, this could include support ideas with details and examples, use voice appropriate to the purpose and audience, edit writing to produce a logical progression of ideas. In reading for a Depth of Knowledge 4, higher order thinking is central and knowledge is deep at Level 4. The standard or assessment item at this level will probably be an extended activity with extended time provided. The extended time period is not a distinguishing factor if the work is only repetitive and does not require applying significant conceptual understanding and higher order thinking. Students take information from at least one passage and are asked to apply this information to a new task. They may also be asked to develop hypotheses and perform complex analyses of the connections among texts. Some examples that represent but do not constitute all of Level 4 performance are analyze and synthesize information from multiple sources, examine and explain alternative perspectives across a variety of sources, describe and illustrate how common themes are found across texts from different cultures. Writing at a Level 4 could include write an analysis of two selections, identifying the common theme and generating a purpose that is appropriate for both. Here is Karen Hess's cognitive rigor matrix. Here she has correlated the depth of knowledge levels in their relationship to Bloom's taxonomy. The intersection of one, let's say, understand for Bloom's taxonomy, and Webb's depth of knowledge 2 could include descriptive terms and descriptive statements such as locate information to support explicit or implicit central ideas. Now let's apply what we have learned here about the depth of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy. Now we know that the research and the components that make up cognitive rigor, how does this fit with item review? For NAEP, cognitive targets from 2009 and on. That refers to the mental processes or kinds of thinking that underlie reading comprehension. There is locate and recall information from text, integrate and interpret information and ideas presented in text, and critique and evaluate information and ideas presented in text and the ways in which authors present text. Here's a multiple choice item. According to the alien invasion, Australian farmers imported cane toads into Australia in order to, with these option choices, the correct answer is D. The national performance results in reading for informational text state that 84% of the nation's students answered this question correctly. Consequently, the item was deemed as easy. The cognitive target for this item was locate and recall. If we look at the depths of knowledge and the revised Bloom's taxonomy, the depth of knowledge for this item was a level 1, the revised Bloom's taxonomy for this item was remember, and the rationale given for these cognitive rigor placements was that students had to recall, locate basic facts, details, and events from the passage to correctly choose the answer D. Here's another illustrative item. Explain why the home range discusses animals that lived on the Great Plains thousands of years ago. This item is a constructed response item. Its difficulty was deemed as hard, as only 26% of the nation's students were able to answer this item correctly. The cognitive targets for this item were integrate and interpret. The judgments for the depth of knowledge for this item included a 2 based on the scoring guide, and for the Bloom's taxonomy, analyze. The rationale given for this item was that students had to interpret the author's craft to explain why the Home on the Range passage discusses animals that lived on the Great Plains thousands of years ago. Now we will look at how we can use all of this information to make our own item review judgments and alignment decisions.